In 1912, the Titanic sank. The whole world was left in shock. Nearly 1,500 people lost their lives in that disaster. It took the ship 2 hours and 40 minutes to go under. But what if I told you that just 2 years later, another ship sank, and it went down in only 14 minutes? Yes, you heard that right. Just 14 minutes. More than 1,000 people died. And yet, the astonishing thing is, most people have never even heard of this disaster. History has almost completely forgotten it. No, this is not the Titanic. And it is not the Lusitania either. This is the Empress of Ireland, the worst maritime disaster in Canadian history. And today, we are going to find out exactly what happened that night, why so many people lost their lives, and why the entire world forgot about this heartbreaking tragedy. So let us begin. To understand this story, we first need to know what the Empress of Ireland actually was. In the early 20th century, transatlantic travel between Europe and North America was an enormous industry. Shipping companies were competing fiercely with one another, each trying to build the biggest, the fastest, and the most luxurious ocean liners. The British had the White Star Line and the Cunard Line, and the Canadians had Canadian Pacific steamships. The crown jewel of this company was the RMS Empress of Ireland. The ship was built in 1906 in Glasgow, Scotland, by the Fairfield Shipbuilding Company. She was about 570 feet long and weighed around 14,191 gross tons. Now, she was not as massive as the Titanic. The Titanic was nearly 3 times her size. But in her own class, the Empress of Ireland was truly a remarkable vessel. And she was not just beautiful, she was fast. On the route from Quebec to Liverpool, the Empress of Ireland was one of the most popular ships afloat. From 1906 to 1914, over the course of 8 years, she crossed the Atlantic 96 times. Every single time, she made it safely. No one could have imagined that her 97th voyage would be her last. May 28, 1914, Quebec City, Canada. By the afternoon, crowds had gathered at the harbor. The Empress of Ireland was preparing to set sail for Liverpool, England. A total of 1,477 people were boarding the ship. Among them were 87 first-class passengers, 253 second-class passengers, 717 third-class passengers, and 420 crew members. There was one group among the passengers that stood out: 171 members of the Salvation Army. They were heading to London for an international conference organized by their movement. Entire families were part of this group: husbands and wives, parents and children, little boys and girls. Everyone was happy. Everyone was excited. At around 4:30 in the afternoon, the ship pulled away from Quebec Harbor. She moved steadily down the St. Lawrence River. Evening came. Night fell. The passengers finished their dinner and one by one retired to their cabins to sleep. The ship's captain was Henry George Kendall, an extremely experienced and skilled sailor. He was standing on the bridge, keeping a careful watch over the river. It was about 1:30 in the morning. The ship had traveled roughly 180 miles from Quebec and was near the town of Rimouski. The river pilot had already been dropped off. The ship was now heading toward the open Atlantic. But right at that moment, everything changed. Fog on the St. Lawrence River is nothing unusual. But the fog that rolled in that night was something else entirely. It was so thick that you could not see 10 feet ahead of the ship. The entire river seemed to vanish behind a wall of white. Captain Kendall had noticed a little while earlier that the lights of another ship were approaching from the opposite direction. It was the SS Storstad, a Norwegian coal freighter. She was carrying roughly 6,000 tons of coal and was coming from Sydney, Nova Scotia. Both ships had spotted each other while they were still several miles apart. Captain Kendall could see the green light of the Storstad, which meant she would pass safely on the right side. Everything appeared to be perfectly normal. But then that terrible fog descended. In an instant, everything disappeared. The Storstad's lights were gone. Captain Kendall immediately ordered his ship to stop. The fog whistle began to sound, 3 long blasts, the signal that means my vessel is stopped. On the Storstad, the fog had caused confusion as well. They could no longer see the Empress. What exactly happened next is still debated to this day. The captains of the two ships gave very different accounts, but the outcome was the same. At 1:55 in the morning, the Storstad suddenly emerged from the thick fog, heading straight for the right side of the Empress of Ireland. Captain Kendall shouted out in alarm, but there was no time left. The sharp, reinforced bow of the Storstad sliced into the side of the Empress, penetrating nearly 25 feet into the hull. The heavy, coal-laden ship acted like a giant knife cutting through metal, and from that very moment, 14 minutes of pure hell began. When the Storstad pulled back after the collision, what happened next was the most terrifying part of all. A massive hole had been torn open in the side of the Empress, roughly 350 square feet of open space. Through that hole, the ice-cold water of the St. Lawrence River began pouring in at a rate of nearly 60,000 gallons every second. But the large hole was not the only problem. There was something even more deadly. Hundreds of small portholes on the lower decks had been left open. It was late May, the weather was warm, and passengers had opened their cabin windows before going to sleep. As the ship began to lean to one side, those open portholes dipped below the waterline. Now water was not just flooding in through the gash in the hull, it was pouring in through hundreds of little windows as well. Now picture the scene. It is 2 o'clock in the morning, total darkness. 1,477 people are asleep inside the ship. Suddenly there is a violent jolt. The ship is tilting. Water is rushing into the cabins. The lights have gone out because the engine room has flooded and the generators have shut down. Complete and utter darkness. People are screaming. Children are crying. Everyone is trying to get out through the doors, but the ship has tilted so far that the floor of the corridor has become a wall. Climbing up the staircases is nearly impossible. Captain Kendall is shouting orders from the bridge. "Lower the lifeboats! Lower the lifeboats!" But the ship is rolling over so fast that the lifeboats on one side have swung up into the air and cannot be launched. The lifeboats on the other side are already underwater. The ship carried 40 lifeboats in total. Only 4 were successfully launched. On the lower decks, the situation for the third-class passengers was the most desperate. They were housed in the lowest part of the ship. The water reached them first. Trapped in narrow corridors, in freezing cold water, in total darkness. It is hard to even imagine that scene. The 171 Salvation Army members, most of them were on the lower decks. It was later reported that many of them took off their own life jackets and gave them to others, especially to the children. They chose to face death so that someone else might live. Captain Kendall was floating in the water. He later said, "I watched my ship slowly sink beneath the surface, and from every direction I could hear the cries of hundreds of people, but there was nothing I could do." 2:10 in the morning, just 14 minutes after the collision, the 14,000-ton Empress of Ireland disappeared completely beneath the cold, dark waters of the St. Lawrence River. The Titanic had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. The Lusitania went down in 18 minutes. And the Empress of Ireland? Just 14 minutes. That was the most horrifying part. People simply did not have time to save themselves. When it was all over, the numbers were devastating. Out of 1,477 people on board, only 465 survived. 1,012 people lost their lives. Some of the individual numbers are almost too painful to hear. There were 138 children on the ship. Only 4 survived. Yes, only 4 children. Out of the 717 third-class passengers, only 133 made it out alive. Of the 171 Salvation Army members, 150 perished. It remains the single greatest loss of life in the history of the Salvation Army during peacetime. The Storstad did not sink. She remained intact. Her crew were actually the first to begin rescue operations. A few other ships in the area also came to help, but by then it was far too late. Most of the people in the water had already died of hypothermia. After the disaster, investigations were launched. Both Canada and Norway set up their own separate inquiry commissions. And interestingly enough, the 2 investigations reached completely different conclusions. The Canadian inquiry blamed the Storstad, saying she had changed course in the fog, which she should not have done. The Norwegian inquiry blamed the Empress, saying she had suddenly altered her course in the fog. The truth is, no one could say with certainty who went where in that blinding fog. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. If those portholes had not been left open, the ship would not have sunk so quickly. In the wake of this disaster, several important changes were made to maritime safety regulations. Watertight compartments were made stronger. Rules about keeping portholes closed were made stricter. Lifeboat drills were made mandatory. Now we come to the biggest question of all. More than 1,000 people died. It was one of the worst maritime disasters of its time. So why does nobody know about it? Why does everyone know about the Titanic, but almost no one has heard of the Empress of Ireland? The answer comes down to timing. First, the Titanic disaster had happened just 2 years earlier. It was still the biggest news story in the world. The grief had not yet faded. The memory of the Titanic was so deeply etched into people's minds that another shipwreck simply did not capture the same attention. Second, and this is the most important reason, the Empress sank on May 29, 1914. Just 2 months later, on July 28th, the First World War began. The entire world turned its attention to the war. The death of 1,000 people, as tragic as it was, became a footnote next to the millions who would die in the years that followed. Third, this disaster happened on a river, not in the middle of the ocean. It was not caused by an iceberg. It was not caused by a torpedo, a collision with another ship in the fog. That simply does not sound as dramatic. But the result? The result was every bit as devastating. Today, near the town of Rimouski in Quebec, at the Pointe-au-Père Maritime Historic Site, there is a museum. It preserves the memory of the Empress of Ireland. The wreckage of the ship still lies on the bottom of the St. Lawrence River, about 130 feet below the surface. The Canadian government has declared it a National Historic Site, but most people still do not know what happened on that cold, dark night. The Titanic taught us that no ship is unsinkable. The Lusitania taught us the cruelty of war, and the Empress of Ireland? She taught us that disaster needs no warning. Just 14 minutes. In 14 minutes, everything can be lost. 1,012 lives were taken that night, and their memory was lost in the pages of history. Perhaps after watching this video, you will not forget them. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments, had you ever heard of this disaster before? We will see you in the next video. Until then, take care.